Thanks, Product School, for giving us the opportunity to chat today. Appreciate everybody joining us. Going here. So, as mentioned, my name is Tanner Burson. I'm the VP of Engineering here at Prismatic. Uh, Here at Prismatic, my team defines the strategy for platform scaling to support ongoing customer growth and product innovation. I'd like this workshop to be as interactive as we can. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I see a few of you already dropping notes in. That's great. There'll also be time at the end for questions. So as we go, feel free to drop stuff. We'll try and address it as things happen. Let's get started. So just to start with, why are we talking about this? In a recent study, G2 found that integrations are one of the top considerations for SaaS buyers. This is across a variety of different buyer profiles. They all consider integrations to be one of the top concerns as they're looking forward. As we dig in deeper, there's more expectations from buyers than just, do you have integrations? Customers are using more tools. The average mid-market SaaS company has as many as 137 different SaaS and software products integrated into their platform. Customers expect these integrations increasingly to be built into their software, not sidebars, not things that exist outside of the main experience. As folks involved in building SaaS products and leaders of these kinds of products, this creates a challenge. It's easy to start with one integration, maybe a Salesforce or a HubSpot, and bake that into your product. Maybe you get to a second or a third. But what happens when you get to the 10th or 100th integration? How do you do that into your product? And that's where you end up in the kind of perpetual build versus buy scenario. So we mentioned we'd be doing some interactive bits here. So as we kind of hop in, it'd be great to kind of understand how many different kind of software integrations are on your team's roadmap. I'll give kind of a second for you folks to answer in the polls section here, and then we'll move on. Cool. So from the quick reaction here, it looks like a number of folks with a fair number of integrations, which is great and very typical. We often see lots of folks with a large number of integrations upcoming, which is great, and I think speaks to a lot of the problems we're talking to here. So we've talked briefly about why productized integrations are important to the customer, but let's dig into more detail on what building that means and what kind of the trade-offs inherent in that start to look like. At a very high level, there's three phases to any integration. There's building, there's deploying, and there's managing. When most of us think about integrations today, we spend most of our time talking about build. Uh, that's what we do. We build software. It's inherent that that's where a lot of our focus goes. We worry about what does the integration need to do, what kind of data do we want, how do we transform it, how do we get it into our product. Those are the primary concerns. But as we'll talk about here, really building is the easy part of having integrations as part of your product strategy. Because once an integration is built, you still need to figure out how to deploy it into your customer base. Get customer specific configurations, authentication credentials, account IDs, all of that data, and be able to process it effectively. We need to figure out how to handle monitoring and providing feedback to your customers about the status, success, failure, data about those integrations. And you need to lastly be able to manage that at scale. You need internal and customer facing tools for managing those integrations, enabling and disabling them as things change, adding new integrations as your customers' product portfolio changes, updating API credentials to be in line with security policies. The list goes on as to what happens after building. And as a reminder, your average customer has hundreds of these integrations that they may potentially want. And so that becomes kind of an exponential growth problem as you build these out. So we'll start kind of walking through these phases a little bit. So we'll start with building. It's the first phase. It's where we all have to start. One of the first things you run into in building integrations is that most integrations, the most common flow is something triggered by a webhook. You take some sort of inbound event from the third party system, you get a webhook call, and now you need to do something. A lot of those third parties want you to register your webhook, tell it where the endpoint goes, and those registrations are done on a per customer basis. So you need some way within your integration platform to register on a per customer basis each of those events. Sometimes you may have to do that for multiple events. Individual events may have specific webhooks or specific configuration for each of those. How do you automate that kind of webhook registration and scheduling on a per customer basis? How do you turn it off when customers have opted out of integration or changed their needs? Can customers do that themselves, or do they need to work with your team to go through and do that? What about for non-webhook integrations? There's a number of different platforms that don't necessarily have webhooks. Maybe you need to run something on a schedule. Maybe you need to poll for changes. Um, there's a number of different ways that your customers may want to trigger their initial webhook. How are you going to authenticate against each of these third-party services? It's easy to say, oh, well, we'll use OAuth. That's well supported and easy, right? But it turns out OAuth is more of a rough sketch of a standard, and many people will claim to be OAuth compliant and still have their own kind of custom extensions and capabilities. And so there's a lot of edge cases you'll need to handle. You need to figure out how to manage token refreshes, offline credential changes, all of those pieces. You also need some way to test all of this as you're building integrations, as your customers are setting up their configuration. It's an iterative process. So you need some way of testing and iterating through this as you go. Do you do that against live third parties, or do you use test credentials of some sort to work through that? Do you have sandbox accounts at the third parties, or do your customers provide those? Would you instead just test with simulated data because sandboxes or test accounts are too hard to work with? That leads you to moving into production. So you've built a thing, now need to deploy it, get it out into production. What does that kind of promotion process look like? And then what if you end up in the really complex case of, your customers' integrations need to talk to resources that are on premise at their location. So you need to figure out how to work through the security of talking to on premise applications from within your platform. These are a handful of things that I think are key concerns when building key things that I think folks don't often pay enough attention to. But it's certainly not the end of the list. We could spend an entire session talking about nothing but building. But I think ultimately this is the easy part. We build software. We're used to this part. We're used to thinking through these challenges. Ultimately, when you're starting, you're just building more code for your product, so it feels relatively natural and normal. But after the fifth, 10th, 100th integration, these things become more than and small speed bumps and become real challenges. So before we dive deeper into the kind of next phase, let's talk about who's building the integrations within your company now. Are you building your integrations with in-house developers? Do you have an outside team managing it, or do you have non-developers working in a low code or no code tool? Looks like predominantly in-house developers with some outsource. That is a super common approach. I think it will mesh well with what we're talking about in terms of this. Using in-house resources makes a ton of sense. These are core to your kind of product strategy. But we're going to talk a little bit about why that becomes more expensive as we go. So obviously, we're all familiar with opportunity cost. Building integrations is time not spent building features for your product. Um, but there's even more pieces in this that are worth calling out. Beyond the straight time spent not on core product, we've seen, and I've certainly often felt personally that our integration roadmap is often reactive to direct customer needs and less of a proactive strategic investment. It becomes harder to balance against uh, some of those competing priorities. We often have to hurry up and get them in because it will help us land a deal. It will help us close a big customer. It will help improve a gap in our onboarding experience. But as they go, they become increasingly hard to scale. That doesn't get better. The cost of that increases as it scales, not decreases. And then lastly, I think one of the things that isn't talked a ton about, there's often a real monetary cost in building integrations immediately. We talked briefly in the build section about sandbox accounts and testing. We've often seen that some of these third parties have discovered they can charge you, the provider, for sandbox access, and it becomes increasingly expensive to manage all of those accounts as those go. So as we move on here, we will talk a bit about this model. We'll see this slide a couple of times as we go. Um, on the left, we have what we call kind of the services model of building integrations. You have a customer, you need an integration, you build that integration for that customer, and you move on. And then as you move through, you kind of build more and more different versions of that. You deploy it to more and more customers. It increasingly scales poorly. You end up in a kind of unmanageable state. What we're trying to push towards, and what I think everybody ultimately wants to land in, is this more productized model of integrations. Instead of building, unique bespoke integrations for each customer, you build for specific use cases within your product. And you make the customer portions as configurable as you can, publish those integrations into some form of internal marketplace, and then let customers self-serve and self-configure. Now this is more part of your product. This is more in line with buyer expectations, as we talked about at the front. And ultimately, you're landing at a place where more of these pieces are more scalable, more of them are in customers' direct hands and control. And you're building an infrastructure and process that allows it to grow with your customer base and the number of integrations. We'll talk more about these pieces here, but one thing that's worth calling out is that the real trick with this view is that the left model doesn't lead you to the right model. When you start down the left side and you get too far and realize this has become really expensive and really difficult to maintain, you don't naturally transition into the right side. There's not a clear off ramp for how you go from bespoke one off integrations into a more productized model. The longer you take to understand how to fit that into your strategy and into your roadmap, the more expensive that becomes long term. You may choose to start over and build all new. You may have to figure out a way to kind of mesh these together. But ultimately, a lot of the work and a lot of the behavior in your product has to change uh, as you get through there. So next poll, always curious, like how many people have already moved into the productized view of integrations? How many of you are already down this road, and how many of you are working towards it? So looks like relatively even split, a little biased towards still on the roadmap, but a number of folks have already started, which is great. Um, Always excited to see folks who've already seen where this is and already trying to move that direction. So we talked about build, we talked about the next phase being deploy. So let's talk a bit about kind of what happens after building. We're all builders. We focus a lot there, but there's a lot more that goes into a great integration experience than just building the integration. We've talked about this needing to scale. We've talked a lot about how getting the customer more directly involved helps improve that scale. So we need to find ways to drive more of that customer interaction, make it feel like more of our product, make it feel more natural in what we're doing. So what are some of the things that start to lead into that direction? So after you've built a handful of integrations, one of the things you want is customers to select the integrations themselves. You end up building some form of integration marketplace, some sort of dashboard that customers can use to pick and choose the integrations that fit their use cases and to start to drive towards configuring that themselves. Maybe you limit it to one integration. Maybe they have multiple. There's a number of different uh, paths and kind of concerns as you get down that road. Once you start to allow them to build them, you need to allow them to configure them. We talked about API credentials and custom webhook URLs, tenant identifiers. Those sorts of things need to exist on a per customer, per integration basis. And you need some way to manage those and to allow customers to manage the portions of those that may change, that are data that they own about their integrations. And now that we have users being able to do some of their own configuration, we need to provide them some feedback. We need to let them know that the data they've provided is leading to a working integration, that this is ultimately working and behaving in the way that they would expect. That may be providing logs, that may be previewing integration results or data sets. Maybe it's simple things like just status icons in varying places in the product that allow you to see that that's working. But you still have to find a way to provide that data on a per customer, per integration basis, and to keep it up to date so that customers can take the right action as they're moving through your product. And then lastly, one of the kind of more complex product problems across the board is always versioning. So what happens when you've built that integration? You've built that Slack integration, the HubSpot integration, you've got dozens of customers or hundreds of customers using it, and you need to make a change. Do you roll that out to all your customers automatically? What if the change requires new user configuration? How do you drive them to go opt into that change? Um, you're going to need some way to version your integrations and to manage that versioning process. So on top of all of the user configuration and status that we need to have, we need to be able to tie that back to a particular version of an integration as well. And now we need to track which version of each integration each customer has. That leads to questions of, can they roll back to a previous version? Do they have to be on the newest version? Are there unsupported versions? Do you allow them the options to change versions, or is that something only your internal teams can manage? The intersection of user configuration and versioning is an incredibly complex area. There's tons of small and plenty of very large decisions you have to make in this area. And I also think it's one of the areas that's least thought of up front. It's often a problem we discover later in the building process, later in the way we're thinking about uh, our overall integration strategy. And that's tough because it's also a key area of user engagement. It has a large impact on your user experience. So getting this right is really important to how we think about successful rollouts of productized integrations. So we're back to this slide again. So we've now moved down the funnel a little bit. We've built our configurable integrations. We're publishing them to a marketplace. We're allowing customers to self-serve and do configuration, but we still have kind of what happens after that. We've been really focused thus far on getting the integrations into customers' hands. And obviously, that's our main goal. We wouldn't be building these otherwise. But now they're out and they're being used. And now we have maintenance, and now we have support, and now we have all of the other concerns that come with owning a piece of software beyond just the initial build and release. So before we start wading into the kind of third phase of the process, I'd love to hear a bit about what teams within your kind of current companies support and manage your customer integrations. Product management, customer success, customer support, or no one else, the engineering team are the only ones managing it directly. I'll give that a second. So looks like a heavy bias in the early votes here towards engineering managed processes. Um, I think that's super commonplace for folks to start. I think a lot of what we will talk about next is how we can help enable and how a real productized integration strategy can help enable more folks within your company to engage with these. So let's hop into that management side. So we have now integrations live. We have customers using these integrations. We basically have a new chunk of product that's somewhat separate from our core product that we need to manage. Um, it has a lot of the same concerns as our main product. Um, it serves the same customers as our main product. We still have to manage infrastructure. We still have to care about scale, security, observability. But now we need to make sure that we're dealing with a kind of different set of those concerns than our previous existing product may. Integrations may have a very different life cycle than the rest of your product may. Integrations tend to run longer. Um, they may run at particular time windows. You may see very burst heavy workloads of uh, scheduled integrations that run at the same hour of the day. Are your customers bound to specific time zones? So you see really narrow windows of the day taking the bulk of that load. Uh, how do you make sure you can scale up to handle that? Does that scale pattern look different from that of the rest of your product? And because these happen on a customer specific basis, each customer's integration may be very different in terms of workload. One customer may be loading 100 records a day, and another may be trying to load a million an hour. How do you make sure that both of them are getting an effective experience and able to scale and to manage that properly? Maybe your existing product has similar concerns. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe integrations are the first time you're really seeing some of those larger data scale challenges. So the first time you're trying to do it outside of large external batch loads or things of that nature. Security also plays in here. We're talking about SaaS businesses. So if you're already in a multi-tenant environment, you're already familiar with a lot of the core concerns here. But now you have an additional concentration of API keys, user credentials. Those may have different security or compliance requirements than your existing product does. And you need to make sure that you have the additional tooling and things in place to manage that. You'll need a way to handle logs and alerts, both for your use of the product and the platform, and possibly your customers. We've talked a bit about providing better visibility to the customers of what's happening. So you may need ways to route logs or route alerts to the customers so that they can drive more of the interaction there. There's also maybe customer specific needs, and figuring out how to handle those in a way that makes sense across your user base maybe somewhat uniquely challenging. Now, a lot of what we've talked about has largely been product focused, and I think that fits the product school theme and what we're here to do. But part of what we're building is also a platform for ourselves to manage. It's internal product. It's things that we need to use to manage what we're building. And that means some amount of what you're building for your integration strategy involves internal tools. But as we get back to opportunity cost, there's a real balance in terms of the amount of time you spend making the better internal tools for you to manage. Maybe it's less time you're able to spend on making better customer tools. Or maybe you can make some of those work both ways. Um, but regardless, these are still important parts of the overall management process that are still tangential to your core product. These are important to the experience, important to your customers' ability to be successful, but may not be directly in your main roadmap. And you want to see this successful, and success means people are using it, and they're wanting more integrations, and they're wanting more pieces here. As that goes up, the amount that you need to support, the amount of additional debugging and tooling is also going to increase. And so it's important that as you're building the management side of what you're doing, it also keeps in mind that the breadth and the number of people within your organization who need to interact with it will increase. And no matter how much you want every integration to be productized, we did have our kind of left versus right view previously, and not everything may start there. So we may have to figure out how to get from uh, from the services model forward. So if you start on the services model, we've said it's very hard to transition to the right side. But I think it's relatively obvious that most of us who got started probably started down the services path. We didn't really think we needed productized integrations at first. We may not have recognized that that's the path we were on. Um, so, are there any tips or ideas in how you can transition towards that productized model? The poll earlier said many of your this is on your roadmap. This is stuff you're looking at. So we'll talk very briefly about how we can get there if we've already started down the other side. One of the phrases we like to use a lot, and I think it's really indicative of the way this process starts to work. You're not. This isn't a build versus buy decision of are you building an integration platform or are you buying an integration platform? It becomes important to start thinking about how you can build your integrations and your integration strategy with something like an integration platform and how that starts to work. If you started with existing integrations, there are ways that you can wrap something from a productized platform and call your existing integrations or port your existing integrations in. It doesn't have to be a rip and replace operation to start. Um, there are ways to get towards incremental adoption, but it's something you have to start. The longer you wait, the harder that gets to be. Hopefully, at this point in the presentation, we've made a strong enough point that building is important, but the broader picture of what we're looking at is ultimately where most of this work is going to land. And so, the sooner you can start to see the value out of the other side and recognize that, the more successful you will be. So, if I had one point to leave everybody with, it's very simple, very straightforward, and it's just your integration strategy is too important to just wing it. If you improvise, you will miss some of the key opportunities to get real value and to get bigger pieces as you go. So thinking up front, figuring out what your needs really are and making sure that you're building towards that in whatever path that is, ultimately, I think is the real takeaway for me and the real thing I hope everybody learns as part of the session today. So that said, we're going to flip over real quick, and I am going to do the dangerous thing of trying to do a live demo of some of what we've talked about today. So give me 1 second to switch my screen sharing here, and we will take a look at how this works in the Prismatic platform. So we have here is the Prismatic product. As soon as you log in, first thing you're going to see is your dashboard. One of the things I want to call out very immediately is the very top of our screen up here. We immediately have things about alerts, data that we might want to see, things going on. It's not just about building. We're immediately in the mode of looking at our product and how this behaves. Um, so what I want to walk you through isn't how we go build integrations. I've hammered the point that that's not our main focus today. So what I want to walk through is how you might debug a customer issue in production. So we'll talk a bit more about the uncleared alert monitors that are listed here and how we might see those. As we scroll down, we also see we have a graph here of integrations that have run, things that have succeeded. So let's go ahead and say I want to go dig in and understand what have my customers been doing, where are those running, and what's behavior. So we're going to go over to the executions tab here, and what we see is a list of all of the executions. In Prismatic term, an execution is the run of a particular integration for a particular customer. And so we can use this view to see very quickly what's happening in the product and with particular runs. So if we look here very quickly at the top of the view, we can see right to left, this was a Slack integration for the customer bar, and the instance was named Slack. I think customer and integration are relatively obvious in what they refer to. I think instance is a little less self-explanatory. But we talked about all of the different configuration that you need to run an integration. And in Prismatic, the instance is the combination of all of the configuration for a particular customer for a particular integration. So it is the join of that data. So we can see here, the kind of quick view of what happened in this integration, the logs that were written. We could click over into step outputs and see the individual steps and the data that came in and out of each one of them. So we can get a lot of data very quickly. But I said we wanted to go look at something that's broken. We want to go do some debugging. So let's go look at one of these that failed. Um, so if I flip down, we can see for customer foo, the Microsoft Teams integration had an error. I can see this red block telling me that the code block step had an error that was a complex and difficult to debug error has occurred. Great. Well, we can go debug a complex and difficult to debug error then. But I do want to scan through a couple of these other executions to see whether there's any pattern here. So as I hop through a couple of these, I can see different customers each time, but the integration is the same. So clearly we've got an issue with our Microsoft Teams integration. And what's great is if I wanted to look at this, in some different views, I could click through this filter. I could change the time range that I'm looking at. I could say, show me only ones that failed or only that are still running. I could pick a particular integration. I could say, give me just the Teams integrations, give me particular versions, walk through this. So I can use this view to look at a lot of different things across our whole integration portfolio and understand a lot about what's going on quickly. So given that, let's dig in to the integration itself. So we'll click through and we will go to the integration designer. So quick overview. Again, this is not a demo of building integration, so I am going to speed through this. We could spend all day talking about all of the things that we can do in here. Prismatic has a great low-code integration designer, so we can do all of this without writing any code. Or we could flip over into what we call our code native integrations and build this integration entirely with our TypeScript SDK, publish it in the same way, and make it available to our customers in exactly the same way, using the same primitives that we use to build the product. But as a quick overview, kind of you read this top down. So the first thing we see is what we call a trigger. It's what sets off the integration where we get the data in initially. We can see from this that we're receiving a webhook. That webhook is passing its data down to a code block. And then that code block is returning data that's writing a log message. So to just kind of see this in action, we can go down and just run this as a test. So we'll give it just a second. And sure enough, here we can see this execution failed on the code block step. And my output was an error that said, sure enough, this is a complex and difficult to debug error. So let's see if we can resolve that error and fix this for our customers. Obviously, this is a quick demo, so we're not going to do the most complex thing, but it turns out my error was that I threw an error saying that there was a complex and difficult to debug error. So great. I think I have fixed it. Let's run this again and see if it is now working. And success. We can now see this is all green. Our code block is no longer returning an error. So everything from here is good. But now we need to publish this. We need to make this available to our customers. Just because I've built it doesn't automatically put it into our customers' hands. So I'm going to go publish a new version. This version works. I fixed the error. I could add arbitrary comments, as much data as would help me identify and understand what's happening. Later, I opted to make this available to our customer marketplace so our customers could opt into selecting this version if they wanted. So straight from the designer, I can go over to the instances view here and take a look at where this has been deployed. And I can see that the bar, Baz, and foo companies all have this integration running. I can click into each one of these and update it, or I can, given that I know this is broken for everybody, just update it for everybody all at once. So I'm going to go deploy this version to every customer. You can see they've all moved to my new V3. If I go look at the bar company, I can see, sure enough, it tells me it's running V3, tells me it just published. It hasn't ran a new update yet, but I can go ahead for this customer and say, go ahead and run a test just for this customer, and let's see what happens. And we can see it ran the integration. If we flip over to our executions tab, we can see now this succeeded. So now we're able to see a successful run. We get our hello world output. Everything is good. But in the real world, you don't want to be going down. The execution page is great. I can go see what's happening. But if I really want to go stay on top of this, I could go create alert monitors. So we saw those at the top of our dashboard. We go back that we had uncleared alert monitors. So if we go to the monitors page, we can see actually we had been getting alerts that told us that there were 3 events that had failed exactly for what we were looking at. I could have got that straight from here without having to go click through the execution. So I can refresh this, tell it to go check. Everything's still the same. I'm going to go ahead and just clear these because these are all working now. And if I went to our particular customer of good Barco, the way you would configure these monitors, you go to a monitor and say, I want to set up a monitor for a failed execution. And I could say, actually, don't just put it in the dashboard. Go ahead and send me an email. Or I could have a group created that it would send to. So now I will get an email when this integration fails instead of me having to go proactively hunt for it. There's a variety of other events we could trigger on, a variety of other things we could look at, but this gets us kind of the core flow of what we were looking at. So in a very few minutes, we have flown through the product. We have seen an error, we have fixed it, we have deployed it to our customers, and we've resolved an underlying issue. So hopefully this has given you a brief overview on how Prismatic has solved for some of the complexities we were talking about in the presentation, and showed you how an iPaaS like Prismatic can help solve these. So I'm going to flip the screen sharing back over to the deck. We can take any additional questions and move on from there. Any questions? So it looks like a couple of sidebar questions here. So we talked a bit about the uh, transition from the services model to the productized integrations model, and the question was, have we seen anybody successfully do that transition? And the answer is yes. We see this regularly. This is a common place that people come to us. They've seen some of these challenges and are looking for ways to get there. We've seen a number of them come in, find a great path for being able to solve their particular problems, whether they were more on struggling to build for the breadth of integrations that they were running into, or struggling to manage an existing integration portfolio. And we've seen a ton of success with those customers coming through, which is great. So it's a great question. Looks like one other quick question. We talked about transitioning between the two. We talked about the challenges in that. So when is the right time in a kind of company's life or kind of the product life cycle to be thinking about that transition? Uh, Obviously, my bias is present, but I think there's really never too early a time to be thinking about that transition. At Prismatic, we've worked with companies at the earliest stage of their product who recognized that integrations were going to be key to their customer onboarding or to the ability to exist in the product ecosystem that they were in. We've seen them come in at the very early stages and be wildly successful at helping scale what they're doing. And then the flip side, we have customers that are Fortune 500 companies that just recognize this is not core to their product, core to their capabilities, and they really just want something that can come in, fit right in, and solve a hard problem that they just don't want to have to solve themselves. So we've seen success at the super early stages or the super late stages. So I don't think there is ever a wrong time or too early to be able to make that transition. Other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you all. It was great having the opportunity. Oh, looks like one question popped in. Awesome. So, what question was? What is the breakdown of our user base between customer support and product folks, and how long do you find the handoff between engineering and non-technical users? Um, I don't know offhand the exact breakdown of users between them. I would say our usual entry point tends to be within the product and engineering org. So the early stages of the kind of integration process tend to land in the product and engineering side, as that's usually where the need is most immediately recognized. It fits into roadmap, or they see roadmap involving integrations that they don't want to build, and so they're coming in to figure out what to do with that and how to solve it. I think after some of the initial stages, we see that balance shift more towards customer support, sometimes a direct integrations team, or other internal teams, and product, and then often less engineering. If the company's opted to build more of their integrations in the low code environment, they may be leaning more on their customer success, or a some sort of internal services team to build out those integrations for their customers. And then customer support becomes intimately involved in the management and the day-to-day organization of getting customers up and running, and managing that. So I think it depends where a company is at in terms of the adoption lifecycle as to what that breakdown looks like. But we see a lot of them. In terms of length between that handoff, I don't know. I think that really varies depending on what the company is trying to do and what success looks like for them. I think we've seen that go very quickly, and we've seen ones where there isn't ever really a handoff between engineering and the less technical users, because engineering is building integrations in code, and they're involved in that. It's part of the roadmap. It's part of the process for forever. This just becomes part of their product development. And so I think it really varies based on need, and what each company is looking for. But it's a great question. Awesome. Well, really appreciate it. Thanks again to Product School. It was great having the opportunity to chat with everybody today, and hope everybody has a good rest of their day. Thank you all.